Good morning. Good to see everybody. And for those joining us at home, we're glad you could. Though we do hope to see everybody face to face as much as possible. I want to talk a bit about branding today, and by that, I really mean the idea of labeling. And specifically, I'm going to talk about labeling comes out in a lot of different forms. It's not anything new. I do believe that the power of labeling has grown exponentially not in internet age, but in the social media age. Because you have Fortune 500 companies, some of the biggest companies in all the world, in their top meetings at the very top, CEOs, presidents, vice presidents, they are terrified of some hashtag that comes against their company. And those hashtags can be developed just by some random person that wants to throw something out against them. And then they could even go and employ bots, little programs to spread it. And that could hit the bottom line. And so you see that companies walk around essentially on eggshells. Privately, they do mention that to people who talk to them about these ideas. And so they are terrified of being branded. Because they brand themselves. They try to create a brand that other people like. Now, the truth is very often that positive brand they put out there that make everybody buy what they're selling is sometimes a fiction as well. Because most of the time a company wants to make money. That is its primary function. And they put in a lot of goals, a lot of lofty ideas, and a lot of things to make people feel like they can be all in, which is kind of a new thing, that people want to be all in on stuff. Well, I don't particularly like that. Going back to when I ran my company years ago, we had kind of we had a motto, and we had some branding things for us. But for the people that worked in the company, it was, we want you to work hard, and we want you to go have a life. We want you to work hard, we want you to make money, and have a life. We don't want this company to be your life. That's not our goal, not our purpose, but we want to do good work and then go enjoy it. But that was because that was my idea. Really, what didn't come from anybody else in the company. It was because we ran it, even though there was 3 partners of us. It was a benevolent dictatorship. I hope at least I was benevolent, but it really was. My plan, my vision, my direction for the group, and so it could just been me rather than others. But this idea of branding isn't new, and in fact, one of the reasons that companies are so scared of kind of the social media firestorms that can happen is because they can't control it. They can't do anything about it. Because it used to be, before social media could really spread it, it had to be filtered. Any kind of bad news towards a company had to be filtered through journalism to be published in some sort of paper, some sort of magazine. And so there was always a certain delay in it coming out. And then how many people actually would read it? How many people would see it? How many people could spread it? But even so, you had the filter of journalism. And the reality is, I don't believe the filter of journalism exists anymore. I do believe there are people who want to be good journalists, but they're no longer the filter. People can put out whatever they want to put out and then go around them. And so they try to get things out as fast as they can. But we call these things labels, right? And from a company standpoint, you kind of talk about branding, but individually, it's labeling people. And I was thinking about this idea. So I'd been thinking about this for a long time. I could talk about just this go on for a couple hours, but I won't, because I'm going to get to the passages that talk about these issues. But I was thinking about one of my favorite Christmas show, which is Charlie Brown Christmas. I put it back in last night because I was thinking about the scene where Lucy gets behind her psychiatrist's, lemonade stand, and Charlie Brown is like, I'm so depressed. I should be happy. Christmas is coming. Well, I'm so depressed. I don't get it. And she goes like, well, we need to identify your fears so we can label them. And that's a very old show. The idea of labeling things as some sort of solution is not new. Now, and by the way, Charles Schulz was making fun of that movement to simply label things as if that somehow solved the problem. But we like to label stuff. And labels often are given not by the people who wear them, though that's becoming a little more popular as well, but often by opposition. In fact, in Scripture, the term Christian doesn't appear much, 3 times in the New Testament. And there is a lot of thought that, in fact, the term Christian was not used by the disciples of Jesus, but was primarily used by the oppositions when they realized, oh, you're of that group. That they were no longer just Jews or a sect of Jews. They started to realize there was this group of people following this Christ. And so then they labeled it. And when you label it, now we get to, because what do you do when you label it? You say, well, politically, it works. It's why politicians, by the way, just a side note, it's why politicians try to label each other as soon as they can, because if your label can stick, you've actually won a big round. If you can label them with something negative and they can't get rid of that label, and everybody starts believing it and using that word or using those terms about you, then it kind of becomes a albatross around their neck, and you've won a little victory in a battle. And so it's why politicians are regularly hypocrites, because their goal is to win for their side, and I suspect most of them believe their winning on their side is for the greater good. And I do use that in kind of the way, in the more bad way that it's used kind of in literature. The idea of politics being hypocrites is because on all sides, let's just take the 2 sides, the Democrat and Republican, they end up sort of supporting people who do terrible things because they're on their side. And then later, when somebody on the other side does kind of similar terrible things, then they rail at it, and then they have to, make sure everybody knows about it, and they got to label it as evil. Because the other side, when they do things, it's all evil. And that's actually one of the purposes of labeling, is to make them less than, so that I can cast them away. I no longer have to concern myself with them. And the problem with that concept, and I'm going to tell you right now, that is ungodly. There is not a single person, regardless of label, regardless of their evil in this world, that we as God's children should not want to help save, because they're worthy of saving. And by casting them away, we are saying they're not worthy. And it is an evil that spreads, and it isn't new. It's always been around. And I'm going to show it to you in scriptures in Jesus' time. They tried to use it against Jesus. They used it against John the Baptist. They used it against his followers. And in fact, in Peter, when he talks about the word Christian, he may be actually telling the disciples to simply own that label, but make sure that you are practicing good with that label and not evil, so that when they rail against you, they will be, how does he say it? But they will be ashamed. because you were practicing good, but they wanted to say you were this horrible Christian who eats their children and practices cannibalism. These are some of the, kind of fantasy myths that kind of spread in the early centuries. Now, the idea of labeling people, and I want to give you a little bit of example of how labeling sometimes becomes good or bad, even if we don't intend it. And I'm going to give you something that, for some of you here, this might fit. Some of you might be labeled ADD or ADHD, attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And I actually was listening to a psychologist just a handful of days ago talk about this issue. And I've thought for a long time that I don't think it's something that just kind of came out of nowhere. Just recently, if it is a real thing, whatever it might be, it's probably always been around. Well, why is it a bigger issue now than it was, 100 years ago? I think it has to do with the school system, by the way, because we created a school system that everybody had to fit a certain mold, their learning type. And people don't learn the same. We know that, that's kind of pretty well known in psychiatry and psychology, that everybody has different learning styles and learning abilities and learn in different ways. And yet, we really kind of push a structure that doesn't fit everybody. And so then we label those that don't fit. Because most of the time, like my younger brother before it was ADD, it was hyperactive. So he was on Ritalin as a little kid because he was hyperactive. And his activity level was off the charts. I mean, but only in school is that a bad thing? And it's the teacher who can't control them. Now, drives parents crazy too, or trying to get a nap or something. But it didn't harm him. It wasn't bad for him. And yet he was labeled that because it became a nuisance to others. And so that's kind of sometimes the way labels work. And so in ADD, I'll give you a little thing I learned this week. We have 5 senses, right? And those 5 senses, our sight and our hearing, touch and feeling and everything, they are bringing in sensory information 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, even when you sleep. So your brain is connected to all those senses. And your brain has to sometimes learn to shut some of it down so it can focus on certain things. And it's called attention. So attention deficit disorder. So we have 3 mechanisms that focus attention. And so this particular doctor described it in this way. One would be like a spotlight or a flashlight, where you're in a dark room and you could kind of look at one thing on the wall. Maybe there'd be 100 things on the wall, but you had one flashlight to kind of stare at one of them. Or, that's one, so our ability to focus down to the minute detail. And that's kind of one of the abilities. And all of these are on a continuum, by the way. They are not either on or off. Because people think with ADD, ADHD, it's like you either have it or don't have it. That's not really accurate. That's not a truism. It's much like sleep apnea. I have sleep apnea. I'm labeled with that. I know Rich has been labeled that. The actual reality, when I was diagnosed with it and I learned a lot about it, and I didn't learn it from the doctors, by the way, because they just like, oh, okay, we'll take this. Do this. And I'm like, well, I studied it, learned about it. Well, the truth is everybody has sleep apnea to some degree. Normal is 0 to 10 apneas an hour. So if you stop breathing between 0 and 10 times an hour at night, you're normal. It won't bother you. You'll have deep and REM sleep and you'll function totally fine. If you have it between 10 and 30, I think those are the right numbers, it's been a lot of years. Between 10 and 30, it's moderate, and it's going to affect you more. If you have it more than 30, then it's severe. And you basically won't hit REM and deep sleep long enough to recuperate. And so it will have dramatic effects on you during the day. And And so most people don't know that. They think you either have it or don't have it. But it isn't that. It is actually a continuum of stuff. And when it isn't, we don't label it until it becomes some sort of issue we need to deal with. And ADD has the same thing. So, one mechanism that can focus the brain, focus the attention, ignore all the other information and input coming in, and just say, I'm going to focus on this one thing. And the truth is, a lot of people with ADD, ADHD can do that incredibly well. In fact, they often can do it better than other people. In fact, if the learning mechanism was, I want you to focus on this one thing for 15 hours straight, who would be the person that could do it well and the person who couldn't do it well? It would be different people. All of a sudden, we would label different ones with the problem. Because often people with ADD can hyper-focus. And they can, it's like a gamer all of a sudden wants to game and they game for 18 hours straight. I forgot to go to work, huh? And so in ADD, they can focus. And then there's a second mechanism, and that is, it is kind of the floodlight. And it's the actual mechanism of when you drive. Let's say you get a warning sign. In fact, one of the examples I was thinking about, you're on a road and you see a sign that says, be careful of falling rocks. Well, what is the alert attention that you focus on? You go, well, which rock is it? So I can stare at that one. Well, no, that's not the idea, is it? The idea is we're going to pay attention to the whole for any little thing that pops up. So that's a different type of attention. And then the third mechanism is management system. That basically says, wait a second, I know you're focusing on this thing and that's interesting, but in the big picture of life, we need to not do that and we need to focus over here right now. And so those three mechanisms are at work in our brain to handle the sensory input. Animals don't seem to have maybe that third one very well, that they just kind of exist, and the prey animals have kind of this hyperactivity flood thing all the time, and then, something flutters, and they're like, cougar, going to kill me. And then so their systems are just kind of on or off, but they're not managing them. They're not at a higher level thinking, okay, what's more important right now? And so all three of those systems are at work, and they are a continuum of how well you do each of them. And so the people who are all, labeled normal doesn't mean that they do all of those three things well. And the people who's labeled abnormal doesn't mean they don't do all of those things well. Some of them they might do incredibly well, and others they might not do as well. And so what's different, and so these labels often are misleading because they become sort of, I get to just put you in a box because you're now a problem or you're something wrong with you. And so we're going to look at a couple of passages here that see how the people in Jesus' time used the exact same mechanisms to do this to people. And I say this because I really want to urge all of us to stop getting caught up in these and avoid doing it to others and avoid even accepting these labels about people as well. I think it's often very hurtful to actual improvement. And so in Luke chapter 7, in 31 through 34, and I'm going to give you a little background. Starting verse 28, he actually said, I tell you, among those born of women, none is greater than John, yet the one who is least in the kingdom of God is greater than he. And so the people were like, oh, wow, this is awesome, because they liked being baptized by John. But the Pharisees and lawyers who had rejected John's baptism because they were already, they were already the good ones, And he says in verse 31 about this, he says, "To what then shall I compare the people of this generation? And what are they like?" So here's Jesus talking to the people, and he says, what is this generation like? "They're like children sitting in the marketplace calling to one another. We played the flute for you, you did not dance. We sang a dirge, and you did not weep." He said, so you, like, I want to control you. It's like, okay, dance. You didn't dance for me. Like, and so kind of the generation wanted these people to be what they wanted them to be rather than who they are. And so and this is what he's talking about with Jesus and John. He says, "For John the Baptist came eating no bread and drinking no wine, and you say," not partly because he was a Nazarite from birth. He was called by God to be that, which prevented them from having any alcohol. And so he says, he has a demon. So John comes, dressed in these horrible clothes out in the middle of the wilderness, out by the river, and he's baptizing people. And every time all those good people show up, he's like railing at those horrible Pharisees and lawyers. And so the people love him, but they label him as a demon. Oh, demon-possessed guy. So if you hadn't met John yet, and you'd heard the label, oh, there's this guy out there preaching about repentance, and he's baptizing people, and you go, but the high priest said he has a demon, so I don't have to worry about him. Right? That's the purpose of it. That's the reason you label people like that, to tell others, ignore them. So then he says, so then Jesus comes, and he's not like John the Baptist. He's he's more like the people who kind of go to town and are pretty, fit in there, where John didn't fit in the city, right? He's kind of that country folk kind of person. And Jesus fits in, and the Son of Man has come eating and drinking, so doing the things John wasn't doing. He says, and you say, look at him, a glutton and a drunkard. Those probably aren't the worst labels they give him, because the next one is probably worse. A friend of tax collectors and sinners. And so they labeled him with these three things. And he says, yet wisdom is justified by all her children. So those who practice wisdom, regardless of the label, is what's important. Wisdom is known by those who practice it. Those who follow it. It isn't by the label. Having the label of being wise, and we've looked at this in Revelation in our class, a church that had a reputation of being something, but they weren't. Reputations sometimes are true, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're exaggerations. Sometimes they're just gossip that spread, amongst people. So let's go on to the next concept here. If we can brand them good or bad, and we can label them, so then people actually go through the process of trying to label. Once they identify that person, I'm against that person in some way, that I don't want anything to do with that person, then they actually go through steps to create a label. They did that to Jesus. In Matthew 22, and starting in verse 15, they began to try and trap him. And you see actually the Pharisees and the Sadducees are all doing this together. And so the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle him in his words. What does that mean? Have you ever thought about what does it mean to entangle him in his words? Entangle him how? Get him to, so the purpose of all of this is to get him to say something they can use against him. Even if he misstated something. How many times have all of us misstated things? I've done it. My people sometimes come up after and say, oh, I might have used the wrong verse or he said the wrong name. Dave used Hebrews 12 when he talked about the great, cloud of witnesses, which it refers to in 12, but actually the great cloud of witnesses, Abraham and Noah are all in Hebrews 11. We all make misstatements, right? But do you want your misstatement to be your defining character? And does it? No. If you're an honest person, somebody else's misstatement doesn't render them useless, unless your whole point is that you just don't want anything to do with them and you're looking for some way to cast them away. And that's what they were doing to Jesus. They were trying to entangle him in his words. And so they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians saying, Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully. Why did their sentence start that way? Don't the people coming trying to trap you come, don't they usually come, as a real enemy and telling you how much they hate you and then try to trap you? No, that's really not the way they usually trap you. They try to trap you by, spreading a little honey around. And that's what when we're going to look at another passage why Jesus might have responded to somebody a certain way. But anyways, they come and they're like, tell us then. He says, you don't care about anyone's opinion. You're not swayed by appearances. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Now, one of the reasons they're asking this is not for the answer. They think the way they ask this, because there are different sects within Judaism that disagreed on this question. So they thought no matter what he answers, we're going to get a whole group of people upset at him. That was their thought. Now, his answers in all of these basically hinder them because they don't know what to do with his answers. He says things in a way that I can't use that. I don't know what to do with that. And so I'm not going to focus on his answers in each one. The Sadducees came after that, and they say, who wanted to say there's no resurrection. And by the way, they were a minority group, but who's the most powerful group in many ways of the Jews. And yet there's no resurrection. So your blessings are only about this life. That was their kind of purpose. And so they're like, they kind of present him a question was, if a man dies having no children, his brother must marry a widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first married died having no offspring, left his wife to his brother. When somebody is setting up a sort of convoluted situation, you should know most of the time they are setting you up. Right? It's like, 7 brothers. I had to marry 7 different brothers in order to have children. Well, in the resurrection, whose wife is she going to be? And he's like, you guys don't know what you're talking about. They have bad ideas. They don't know what they're talking about. And so he's like, in the resurrection, we're not given in marriage. Because one of the primary purposes of marriage is to raise up children. And without that purpose, there's no real reason for marriage. And so he says, because we can be, but anyway, he tells them, they don't know, and they're kind of astonished and don't know what to do with him. They can't label him again. And then the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees. They gathered together in verse 34, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Now, let's see if he understands. Because they had already kind of agreed that the first and greatest commandment was to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your mind. They had already kind of agreed that. Well, let's see if he knows that. And if he doesn't, then we can kind of attack him. But then he's like, he has to fill in. He goes, the second one is to love your neighbor as yourself. I do suspect that he told them that second one because are they loving him, who is their neighbor? No. And then they come in the last one. Now, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them a question saying, what do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? And they said to him, the son of David. And then he asked them a question. How is it that David in the Spirit calls him Lord, saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet? If then David calls him Lord, how is he his son? And they all went, I have no idea. And so from that day on, nobody dared ask him questions anymore. Like, well, okay, we're going to try and stop this whole getting him to misstate stuff because he makes us look foolish every time we try this. So, but that doesn't stop them. In Matthew 26, he actually now deals with his arrest, and it tells us, starting in verse 59, the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death. But they found none. So here they are. They're sort of in a trial. It is a joke of a trial. He hasn't done anything worthy of death. They essentially know that. And that's why they're trying to get people to make an accusation in the city. So they're trying to be like it's really legal. Okay, we're in court. And we need people to come. And we need them to say what he did, what sin he did. And so they're coming and they're saying stuff. And none of it's sticking. That's what it means by, and none of them, were found, to basically stick to him. He says, though many false witnesses came forward. That means a bunch of false witnesses came and said stuff, but it didn't stick. And so, at last, 2 came forward and said, this man said, I am able to destroy the temple and to rebuild it in 3 days. Now, that is essentially a misunderstanding of what he meant, but it is essentially what he said. He told them that they would destroy this temple and he would raise it up in 3 days. He was referring to his body, them killing him and him raising back up to life. But they used his statement to then attack him. And that's what people do all the time. And it's like, even if you disagree with people politically or otherwise, to use their statement sort of out of context is ungodly. And it is wrong for us to practice that. And we shouldn't be participating in that. And it is done. I really struggle to watch almost any news people today on any side, because they do these things all the time. And there are a few people I do listen to who are kind of more in the middle. They might be more left, they might be more right, but they don't attack people just because they're on one side or another. They at least are thinking through ideas in a sort of honest way. It doesn't mean I always agree, but there's not a lot of that happening right now in the public sphere. On TV, in news. And so it's sad and unfortunate, but it's not new. It's always been this way. They basically, as I talked about, they threw everything up and said, well, what sticks? Oh, this one sticks. And it's like what people use, people use videos of people, right? Politicians will do this. They'll take some little clip, some little statement some politician made, and maybe take it out of context and then use it in an ad, and it looks really bad. And sometimes we like them because it's somebody we don't agree with, but the reality is it's often not accurate. It's not completely true, because it is a statement taken out of its context to try and manipulate people's thoughts and opinions. And this is all the devil's work. This isn't God's work. God didn't operate this way. Jesus didn't operate this way. The truth and wisdom doesn't operate this way. Just like Proverbs talks about, wisdom speaks in the open square. And the people who don't want it, they run away from it. But wisdom does not speak quietly in the dark, in some corner somewhere, gossiping about it. That's not wisdom. That's not where truth is. And yet we do these kinds of things all the time. They did it to him. And so let me go to the last one, kind of show you the process. And they did this to cast him away. Now, and this is one of the disciples. This is actually the blind man in John 9. In John 9, and I'm just going to hit at this little section 24 through 34. After Jesus, it's kind of interesting when Jesus heals the blind man. He doesn't just heal him. He actually puts kind of spit and dirt, and makes mud, puts it in his eyes, tells him to go wash. Can you imagine what you would, if you had video of some guy, doing that to a blind person and telling him he has to go wash it off in a particular place, and nobody in your group helped him? And he's got like 14 guys with him at least, plus some women. He's probably got 20 people, and none of them help him. How bad that would look on video. Anyways, the blind man goes and washes, and he's healed, and nobody had ever even heard of a person born blind ever having their eyes healed. Hadn't happened. This blind man knew. And then so in the process, they are kind of, now the leaders are using this blind man because they're all about Jesus. They don't even care what happened to this blind man. They don't even care about the good that happened to him. They're all about what did Jesus do because they did it on a Sabbath day. We've got to use this to get him. And so for the second time, after they'd already kind of talked to him and seen what happened, and second time they call him back because they already kind of investigated his parents and go, was he really born blind? And they're, yeah, he was born blind, but leave us out of it. And so for the second time, he calls the man back, and they say, give glory to God. We know this man is a sinner, talking about Jesus. By the way, that statement is what was said by Joshua to Achan when Achan stole all the devoted things in Jericho, which caused him to die and his family to die and all his animals to die or be killed, executed. That's the statement. Give glory to God. Kind of sounds like tell the truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God, but that's not what it means. It means we know what the truth is, you better say it. That's actually what the threat is to him. And so he answers, whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I know, though I was blind, now I see. And they said to him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And he answered them, I have told you already, you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? And he obviously knows that they don't. So he's obviously kind of poking at them with that. And they reviled him, saying, you are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from. The man answered, why, this is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And they answered him. Did they answer his argument? No. Because there's no answer to his argument. His argument was true, as far as any of them knew. And so they can't answer his argument, so they attack him. You were born in utter sin. By the way, that is a reference to him being born blind. That's not a reference to just being born in sin. They didn't think that way. That concept of original sin was not one they had. But they looked at somebody born with a defect, that was because of somebody's sin. That was why the question about the blind man came up with Jesus' disciples. Whose sin caused that? Because they were confused. Which is why he was trying to correct their misunderstanding. But that's what they're saying. You're born in sin, and you would teach us? Yeah, he kind of did. And they cast him out. They didn't deal with what he actually said. They weren't happy for this man who had had a wonderful miracle happen to him. Instead, they attacked him and cast him away and hated him. And this is actually what people do on a regular basis. They do it when they draw up sides. Which side is evil and which side is good? And I didn't bring up the one passage today. We're going to sing here in a bit. But Jesus actually talked about to the rich young ruler when he came to him and said, "Good teacher, what more should I do to be saved?" And he says, "Why do you call me good? No one's good but God." One of the things that would help us all is to understand there are no human beings that are good. We're all sinners. And to find out that some person that we looked up to and respected, that they practiced sin, or you saw them commit some sin, it shouldn't throw your worldview. It should be, okay, hopefully they're not continuing in it and they're not just regularly practicing it, but that's because they're a human being. Because only God is good. The rest of us are sinners. And we don't always do good. Now, hopefully we can walk with him to learn to practice good and to practice it most of the time. But most of the time, we're not going to practice it all of the time. There are rarely weeks that are going to go by that you and I haven't had ungodly attitudes or practices. And that hopefully we turn from, and repent from, recognize. But we're not good. We are sinners who need his salvation. And so we're going to sing this, "I am thine, O Lord." That's our commitment as Christians. I'm his. Not because I'm good, but because I'm not good. And I'm his to walk with him, to follow him, to have him lead me, to be my Lord, as I talked about on Wednesday. My master, who says, "Go," and I say, "Okay." He says, "Jump," and I say, "How high?" Now, I don't do that for other people, but I do that for my master. If you're here today and you need something, if you need help in this process of walking with him, because we all do from time to time, we all struggle in this process. And if you're here today and you need help in something, and we can serve you, and we can help you, and we can comfort you, or rejoice with you, whatever it may be. If you're here and we can serve you in any way, please, let's go ahead and stand and sing.
I am thine, O Lord, I have heard thy